In the heart of the mountains, remote region of Missouri, there is a story that few know and even less dare to tell. Between deep valleys and dense forests that block the sun, families lived isolated by generations, creating a world of their own with your own rules. In 1978, the rural doctor Dr. Robert Eleanor documented for the first time the case of sisters Whitaker. Eleanor, Margaret, and Ruth, born between 1932 and 1937, were daughters of cousins of first degree, that in turn descended from a family line with centuries of marriages between relatives. When I first visited that property, I noticed something peculiar, wrote Dr. Lon in his medical diary, now preserved at the University of Missouri. The curtains remained closed even during the day. I was received by the older brother, Thomas, the only one apparently without visible deformities. What the doctor found inside that isolated house would disturb him for the rest of his career. The three sisters had severe facial deformities, jaws misaligned, asymmetrical eyes, cranial malformations, and extreme dental problems. Even more impressive, they all wore handmade cloth masks, even inside from home, even in the presence of the family itself. Eleanor, the oldest, was the one who first removed his mask so I could examine it, said Liston. The reflection of pain in his eyes when he realized my initial reaction remains with me to this day. The medical analyses revealed that the Whitaker sisters suffered from mandibular facial dysostosis, a rare genetic condition usually associated with Treacherin syndrome, but with particularly severe manifestations due to successive marriages. Consanguineous. Parish records and local censuses surveyed later, they confirmed at least 7 generations of weddings among cousins in the family. The external world remained ignorant about the existence of the sisters until 1983 when a brief mention in a regional medical newspaper caught the community's attention. Scientific. However, the family consistently refused any public exposure, protecting the sisters from social scrutiny. The story of the Whitaker sisters is not an isolated case. On the contrary, it represents a broader phenomenon in the isolated rural communities of America, where isolation, geographical, cultural, and religious, created conditions for marriage practices. Consanguineous persisted long after they were widely abandoned in other places. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. Cases like the Whitaker sisters are rarely documented with this depth, and our research brings to light stories that the society prefers to forget. To fully understand the drama of women who hid their faces behind masks, we need to understand the science behind their conditions. Dr. James Warren, geneticist at the University of Columbia, who studied similar cases in 1992, explains, consanguinity itself does not create new genetic mutations. What she does is increase the chance that harmful recessive genes, which usually they would remain numb by generations, manifest when the same genetic variant is inherited from both parents. In the specific case of the Whitaker sisters, later genetic analyses revealed an extraordinary concentration of deleterious recessive alleles, a genetic storm perfect that resulted in the severe deformities that afflicted them. The medical records of Shannon County, Missouri, preserved in the Historic Archive State, show that between 1920 and 1970, the incidence of congenital defects in this region, it was 47% higher than the national average. A 1965 public health report, which remained classified by decades due to concerns about stigmatization of community, documented clusters of congenital malformations in specific families. The communities of the Ozark Mountains have developed triple isolation, explains the anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mackenzie, who has studied the region for 2 decades. First, the geographic insulation with precarious roads and rugged terrain. Second, isolation cultural with deep distrust of outsiders. Third, genetic isolation with a limited group of potential partners. This isolation was not accidental. Historical records show that many of these families deliberately fled the scrutiny of the wider society. The Whitaker, for example, were descendants of settlers who settled in the region in the 1830s, deliberately choosing remote lands to avoid religious persecution. The community developed marriage practices that favored unions within the same family circle, often justified by particular religious interpretations and need to keep the earth inside the family. Local church documents dated 1875 show a local pastor defending marriages between cousins such as blessed by the Lord to maintain lineage of the lineage. In 1952, when Eleanor Whitaker was 20 years old, an itinerant doctor offered surgical treatment to alleviate their deformities. The family refused. According to the report Dr. Eleanor, they saw the condition of girls not as a disease but as a divine trial that should be supported with dignity. Masks emerged as a practical solution. Initially made by the mother of girls and later by themselves, the masks were carefully sewn with dark fabrics covering most of the face with openings only to the eyes. Rare photographs preserved in the medical archive of Dr. Eleanor show that the masks were surprisingly elaborated with embroidered details that suggested an idealized face. The paradoxical tragedy is that the same isolation that contributed to its conditions also protected them from the cruel social scrutiny that would certainly face in the world outdoor. In the few interviews given to Dr. Eleanor between 1978 and 1985 gathered in his confidential medical archive partially released for research in 2010, the sisters Whitaker revealed fragments of their extraordinary lives. Margaret, the middle sister, described his daily routine. "We woke up before dawn to do the tasks external. It is better to work when it is dark." The three sisters developed a meticulous system to minimize their exhibition. They cultivated a garden in the back of the property surrounded by tall trees, created chickens and goats, animals that, according to them, did not care about appearances. The brother Thomas took care of all interactions with the outside world, shopping in the city, negotiations, bank affairs. "Elan was the best seamstress I've ever met," said an elderly neighbor in 1992, who occasionally had exchanged eggs for embroidery with the family. "I never saw your face, but your hands created true works of art." The Whitaker house, documented in rare photos of the county file, was a two-story structure with small windows and permanently closed curtains. The interior, according to descriptions, was surprisingly organized and clean with mirrors notably absent. The walls of the room displayed photographs of distant ancestors of generations prior to severe deformities. Ruth, the youngest of the sisters, kept a detailed diary partially preserved in archives of the Historical Society of Missouri. In an entry of 1965, she wrote, "Today I observed my reflection in the well water for a moment with the light of the dusk, almost it seemed normal. I dreamed what it would be like to walk around the city without shouting or whether drive away." The masks became more than simple coverage. They were alternative identities. Each sister had several masks for different occasions. Eleanor, the most skilled with needle and line, created masks with subtly different expressions, one with a slight smile for special days, another more neutral for everyday life. "The most extraordinary," wrote Dr. Liston, "is that even when they are alone in home, they rarely remove the masks. Margaret explained to me that they got used to so much to use them that they feel naked without them." The few visitors who entered the house, especially Dr. List and occasionally the local pastor, reported that the sisters seemed to have developed a body language elaborated to compensate for limited facial expression. Hand gestures, inclinations of head, and variations in posture communicated emotions that their covered faces could express. Medical records show that in addition to facial deformities, the sisters suffered from secondary health problems. Eleanor had severe scoliosis, Margaret presented progressive hearing loss, and Ruth suffered from chronic breathing problems. All characteristics consistent with syndromes associated with prolonged consanguinity. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Behind each mask, there is a soul that longs for dignity. The lives of these women remind us how acceptance and compassion are gifts that many have never known. The story of the Whitaker sisters, though extraordinary, is not unique. Research conducted by the Institute of Human Genetics at Johns Hopkins University between 1985 and 1997 identified at least 27 family centers in the Americas with similar standards of genetic isolation and high rates of consanguineous marriages resulting in clusters of severe genetic conditions. In 1976, medical anthropologist Dr. Eduardo documented the case of veiled women in an isolated community in the mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. 5 women from the same extensive family had facial deformities similar to those of the Whitaker sisters and adopted similar practices of concealment. Dr. noted the masks have become part of their cultural identity, transforming a need in tradition. In the Appalachias region that extends our several states of the East American, the study of health of isolated communities conducted between 1970 and 1982 identified multiple cases of congenital malformations in communities with high endogamy rates. The study controversial at the time for its ethical and social implications, it remained partially confidential until 2005. The Melundian community, an isolated tri-racial population of the Appalachias, presented cases documented in Hancock County, Tennessee. The rural doctor Dr. William Kennedy registered in 1963. I found for adult women using permanent veils, all same family lineage. Local residents respect their privacy, but foreign often react with cruelty. In Nova Scotia, Canada, the small community of Fishers harbored the case of MacDonald sisters, descendants of Scottish settlers who arrived in 1820 and remained extremely isolated. The three sisters, born in the 1940s, had severe facial deformities due to multiple generations of marriages between cousins. Parish records confirm 7 weddings among first cousins degree in just 3 generations. The isolation of these communities was not only geographical but also formational. A review of medical records from the Appalachias region carried out by Dr. Harold Mitchell in 1988 revealed that basic information on genetic risks associated with consanguine marriages rarely reached these isolated communities. When arrived, often they were disregarded as external interference in established traditions. In an interview with the medical newspaper Frontiers in Genetics in 1990, an identified woman just as MS of an isolated community of Kentucky, which also used masks to hide severe facial deformities, said, "No one told us that marrying cousins could cause problems. It was what everyone did. My parents were cousins. My grandparents were cousins. When my face started to develop differently, everyone thought it was just bad luck." A consistent pattern emerged from these various cases. Geographical isolation created the conditions for genetic isolation, often reinforced by religious beliefs or cultural that favored marriages within the same community or family. The subsequent social stigmatization deepened this isolation, creating a cycle that persisted for generations. Dr. Paul Bugman, a geneticist who studied multiple cases, observed in 1990, more disturbing aspect is not the genetic conditions itself, but as the answer to these conditions often worsened the suffering of affected families. Public health records reveal that in many of these cases, medical interventions basic that could have softened some complications have been refused or never offered. Isolation, initially a cause of conditions, also became an obstacle to treatment. The investigative journalist Michael Harkins, who tried to document some of these cases in 1988, wrote, "I found closed doors, non-answered calls, and occasionally veiled threats. These communities have learned through painful experiences which exposure rarely brings benefits and often results in humiliation." Anthropologist Dr. Caroline Fisher, who has studied communities isolated for 3 decades. Note, the use of masks, veils, or other methods of concealment became more than a practical response to physical deformities. In many cases, it has evolved into a distinct cultural expression, almost an act of resistance against a world that rejected them. Time did not stop in the Ozark Mountains. In 1987, Eleanor Whitaker passed away at 55 due to respiratory complications, a secondary condition related to its craniofacial malformations. Margaret followed in 1995 at the age of 61. Ruth, the youngest, he lived until 2002, dying at the age of 65. The family home abandoned after the death of Ruth and brother Thomas, 1998. He remained for years as a monument silent to lives lived in the shadows. In 2008, a fire destroyed the structure, taking with it the last physical traces of that extraordinary family. However, the legacy of the Whitaker sisters and similar women in the Americas persists unexpected forms. In 1992, the Craniofacial Anomalies Foundation was established, partially inspired by the cases documented by Dr. Liston. The foundation offers surgical treatment and psychological support for children and adults with facial malformation severe. Dr. Rachel Cohen, plastic surgeon specializing in facial reconstruction, commented in 2010, "Cases like the Whitaker sisters show us the human cost of failures in our health systems and social support." Today, many of these conditions can be treated with relatively simple surgical interventions if identified early. Advances in genetic counseling and prenatal diagnostic techniques mean that many of the conditions that afflict AIMS, prevented or treated. However, social stigma associated with facial deformities persists, although in more subtle ways. The discovery in 1999 of some of the original masks of the Whitaker sisters preserved for a neighbor after Ruth's death. He offered surprising insights. The masks now starts from the permanent collection of the University of Missouri reveal an extraordinary handicraft made with multiple layers of fabric carefully sewn. Each mask has a subtly facial characteristics, defined contours of cheeks, suggestion of lips, even eyebrows embroidered. These are not simple utilitarian coverage, noted the museum curator, Dr. Elizabeth Chen. These are attempts to recreate the facial normality that genetics has denied them. There is a moving dignity in this effort. In a rare interview given to Dr. Lon in 1980, Ruth Whitaker explained the meaning of masks for her and her sisters. People think we use them to hide us, and this is partially true. But we also use them to reveal ourselves way we choose. When I make a mask, I decide who I will be that day. It is a power that my real face never gave me. Ruth's diary, which covers almost 4 decades of her life, offers glimpses moving of a reflective and deeply sensitive woman. In a 1972 entrance, she wrote, "Some people think we live tragic lives stuck in this house with these faces, but we know joy, too. When Eleanor plays piano to dusk. When Margaret tells stories that make us laugh to tears, when Thomas returns from the city with a new book to read together. At these times, I forget completely from masks." In isolated rural communities, practices of consanguineous marriages have decreased dramatically in recent decades due to greater mobility, access to education, and awareness of genetic risks. However, in some remote regions of the Americas, genetic isolation persists as a public health challenge. The study Marriage Standards in Isolated Communities, published in 2018 by National Institute of Health, documented 87% reduction in marriages between cousins of first degree in U.S. rural areas since 1950. However, the same study identified pockets where endogamic practices persist, especially in communities with strong religious or cultural isolation. The stories of the women who live behind masks remind us of the lasting power of social stigma and extraordinary human resistance in the face of adversity. As wrote Ruth Whitaker in her diary in a 1997 dated entrance. "Behind this mask, I have lived a complete life, limited in some respects, yes, but rich in others. I have known love, beauty, and purpose. What else can anyone ask? If you watched so far, it is because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched here so that I can meet you and know who really accompanies the channel.' Don't forget to subscribe to know more stories like this. Stories that reveal forgotten aspects of our humanity shared. Leave your like to support this work of historical documentation and share with someone who values to understand human experiences throughout its complexity.